Thank you all very much for joining us today for another session of Beyond Mining, Protecting Land, Water and Life. I'm Kim. I use she, her pronouns. We've got Will down there and Nat as well, who are both helping us on tech today. Do you guys want to say hi as well?
Hey there. Welcome.
Cool. So, Will.
Hey everyone, sorry, struggling to get to the mute button. Hi, good to see you all.
So have you got any problems with tech or any questions that you want to chuck in the chat? Will and Nat have got you back there. First of all, I just want to start by acknowledging that we're hosting this meeting today on unceded Wurundjeri country. We want to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We also pay our respects to First Nations people around so-called Australia, around the continent, who have been protecting country for time immemorial. We also want to pay our respects to any First Nations people tuned in now with us or later on Facebook Live, and to First Nations activists today who are fighting for country and culture despite ongoing colonialism. Also to Indigenous people around the world, many of whom have spoken on this conference. We pay our respects to them. They really are on the front line of extractivism around the globe and fighting for land, water and life. So yeah, thanks again for joining us. A few housekeeping things. We will be putting all the participants on mute if our tech people can do that, just for the size of the meeting. And our amazing speakers today are actually pre-recorded interviews. Unfortunately, they had a bit of a time clash, but they're still amazing to tune into. If you have any questions though, still feel free to chuck them in the chat. We'll hopefully be able to follow up to answer them for you, or maybe we'll be able to send some resources out depending on what you're interested in. So don't hold back on the chat box questions. So a little bit of a background quickly before we dive into speakers. Bougainville is a place that was initially a part of the Solomon Islands. Mikamui is one of the traditional names for it. And a French colonizer named it after himself, Bougainville, and it was occupied by the Germans and the British for a while, and then Australia was actually the colonial administration for a while. Japan grabbed it during World War II, and then Australia again until 1975, when it became part of Papua New Guinea, when Papua New Guinea was granted independence. But Australia was quite active in opening one of the world's largest copper and gold mines, the Panguna mine, as you can see marked on the map there. And it operated from 1972 to 1989 and generated almost $2 billion in revenue for an Australian subsidiary of Rio Tinto and its subsidiary Bougainville Copper Limited and the Papua New Guinean government. But for those whose land it was, the traditional landowners in the Panguna area in Bougainville, they saw less than 1% of the profits, and the legacy that this mine left behind was environmental degradation, pollution of the river systems and destruction of the arable land in the area. It also actually started a violent civil war, an uprising by local people, starting with sabotage and then guerrilla warfare against, sorry, well, I am speeding ahead of the slides, against the environmental degradation and the unfair distribution of profits, meant that there was a civil war from 1989 to 1997, and 15,000 to 20,000 people died in this conflict, which is about 10% of the population. That wasn't just from the conflict itself, but it was also because the Papua New Guinean Defence Force established a sea blockade to actually isolate the island and stop any access. So in an attempt to turn people against the revolutionaries who were fighting for their land. We're actually screening a film this evening called The Coconut Revolution, which goes into a bit of that background. So join us for that. But yeah, the environmental destruction there was intense. The development of the pit alone required blasting away half a mountainside and clearing about 220 hectares of tropical rainforest and spraying the undergrowth with Agent Orange. And the Jaba and Karawong rivers were very, very affected with copper and tailings leaching and things like that as well. So there was a peace agreement established in 2001, and that gave birth to the autonomous Bougainville government. But Bougainville is still currently fighting for full independence from Papua New Guinea at the moment. And 98.34% of eligible voters this year voted in a referendum vying for full independence for Bougainville. So that's what's happening over there at the moment. In terms of Australia's involvement, the Australian Army actually backed the PNG Defence Force in the Civil War as well. And so that's their part in accountability there. And in 2013-14, a bit of the environmental impact was assessed, the impact of the mine. Rio Tinto and Bougainville Copper Limited actually exited the area during the conflict, which meant whether they had any intention to remediate the area or not is up in the air, and a lot of people say it was quite negligent, but they had to exit the area, which means any remediation of the environmental damage of the area had to be delayed. In 2013 and 14, there started being discussions within Rio Tinto about reopening the mine. So in those discussions, they did actually recognise the environmental damage, and the traditional landowners at the time said, we're not having this discussion until we can remediate the environmental damage. Like, we're not talking about reopening it until we can actually address these things. At which point Rio Tinto divested completely and sold Bougainville Copper Limited to the Papua New Guinean government and the autonomous Bougainville government. So that was where they cut and run. Recently this year, an exciting development's happened. The Human Rights Law Centre released a really comprehensive report in April this year of the impacts on various communities in the Panguna area. And in November this year, the Australian government agreed to mediate talks between Rio Tinto and these Bougainvillian residents about these environmental impacts. So as you can see, all these little houses along here represent the areas that interviews were done by the community and by the Human Rights Law Centre. So it's a really comprehensive report, which we will share at the end of this. I highly recommend you reading it to really absorb what is going on there and what's been experienced by communities on the ground as part of these ongoing legacy issues that are of environmental human rights importance. So with that little bit of background, I'm going to share an interview with our first speaker. Our first speaker is Theonila Matbob. She's a traditional landowner from the Makosi village, and she is one of the 156 local residents that are submitting the complaint through the Human Rights Law Centre to the Australian government. She's also a young parliamentarian as part of the autonomous Bougainville government for the constituency of Ioro. And she's a teacher by profession and a mother of two. And I will leave the rest to her. I'll just share my screen now and play you the video. First of all, what motivates you to speak on behalf of your community, both Human Rights Law Centre report and also in government? Yeah, thanks so much to talk about. Sorry guys, I've made the video jump. Let me go back. Just to remind you, we're going to be, I thought I'd just ask you.
I think
you'd prefer not to talk about. Sorry guys.
yeah.
Give me 1 minute while I find the right place in the video. Good on you. All right. Well, first of all, what motivates you to speak on behalf of your community, both in the Human Rights Law Centre report and also in government? What is it that you want to achieve for them?
Actually, I should say that the motivation that I have really to be the voice of the voiceless, I should say, back in my community is given, we have so many issues where people do not have that confidence in themselves to speak out for themselves, to represent themselves, simply because of, and I can honestly, from my own assessment, this is what I see. People have never, especially when it comes to the issue of development, from within the area that I come from, people were, the first thing that they were introduced into was the issue of extractivism. And this is the thing that, they've always been at the receiving end, and they do not have the confidence to speak for themselves because they were trained to just accept whatever that comes to them. So this is the real motivation that I've had, and having grown up to see how, behind the authority, you see people are complaining, but when it comes in front, when it's time to face the government, when it's time to face the developers of certain industries, people do not have the confidence. So that's really where the motivation lied for me.
Good on you. That's really amazing. Good on you. Well, I wanted to dive into talking about legacy issues and the report. One of the biggest issues, obviously, is the polluted river systems and the lack of access to clean water. And in all the different areas that there were interviews about lack of access to clean water, access varied depending where people had been relocated to. Can you speak a bit to that more broadly?
Well, with regards to the issues of the legacy issue, I should say that it is much more, for myself and my engagement that I came into, especially with Human Rights Law Center, to participate in the report, I think it's just part of such a very big unresolved legacy issues that lies behind, and it's within the communities. So just to talk about where the report is concerned, yes, well, these are issues that, given the company's presence in the community with the people, and then when the company just walked out because the people decided to rise up against the company, not because simply because they wanted inclusion, they wanted to be included, and they never had the voice, and then they never had that voice to clearly or openly say, talk about their grievances especially. But apart from that, whatever the company left behind is a real concern, where now people do not have the basic needs, water, food, and even as we speak today, there is real hunger for food, especially given the continuous impact and the diversion of the sediments that were washed away from what is now the pit. Because initially this was where the mountains were, and there were 3 big mountains there, and then due to the process of development, people decided to, the company decided to just dump the tailings into the river that a lot of people were depending on. And these are the things that have caused, that have been with the people. When the company was kicked out of Bougainville, people are still living with those things. And this is where, for myself, I come in, and then I started advocating for justice to take place when I was still in high school. So when I was still in high school, I used to talk about, government should listen to the people. As early as the age of 14, I started talking about it because I've realized that, it's not normal for people to participate in bigger things, especially when it comes to nation building, particularly where we are now. They cannot take part in it when they have physical needs. Their worry is about the food. Their worry is about having access to clean water. And their worry is about having land where they can be able to till and then feed their children. So these were the issues that have been with the people. And finally, it's like, to me, the biggest blessing was to have Human Rights Law Center coming to us and then saying, giving us that space after our request to call for Human Rights Law Center, because we were never heard. Like from 2014 coming up, we were calling up for the government. I even raised my voice publicly to say that you have to listen to the people of Panguna especially. But we were ignored by the government, and that was how we were able to come outside of the country and bringing it to where now it is with the Human Rights Law Center of Australia.
Yeah, and something that I didn't understand until I read that report is how ongoing things are, how new areas of land are being flooded by the tailings dams, and people are scared of levees bursting and whole new areas flooding. So that was really shocking. So can you tell us a bit more about, the ongoing impacts and how much land that you're continuing to lose?
For the mine itself, it stretches out all the way into the coastal corridor of Bougainville. From where the mine is, there are different layers of issues that are affecting people today. So I'd like to just briefly give you a glimpse of what it's really like. Around where the cone of the mine is, where the pit is, these people are actually suffering. They are faced with the issue of chemicals in the tailing, and then people are living, literally they're building homes, and that's where their home is. They're living on this, and then you have this pollution that's being breathed in by the people every single day, even by the kids, by youth, and then health issues given all this surrounding that they're living in the polluted surrounding, the polluted tailings. This is what the people, and they have issues of cough and respiratory issues, and even other health complications. If I can be a health worker, then I can detail it, but it's specifically every single day struggle for the people is living on the polluted tailing, because that's not the real land that they are on. Coming down to the next area, which is called the upper tailing under the BCL social mapping. This area we have now, that's where I am from, we are faced and challenged very much by the instability of the land. It's very hard for us now to work the land, plant crops, because every single day or every single season, especially when it's wet season, we are expecting landslides after landslides, and then rivers being blocked, our access to water being blocked. So these are the real challenges that we are faced with. Going further down is where the levees were built by the company, and today as we speak, they're collapsing, especially when the polluted river is pushing to go back to its original course. It's now contributing to dismantling this tailing, the land and the levees as well being collapsed. Like every single month we're experiencing that, and also craters being formed. And with the washing away of the land from the the area number 3 that I'm talking about, these levees, as they collapse and the sand continues to be pushed down towards the coast, new arable land areas are being covered now. So these are the complexities of the issues that we have. And it does not only affect my community, it does not affect the area that I represent as a political representative, but it's now covering over, it's affecting 5 constituencies. That's my constituency, another constituency that's called Bolave, Lato, Torokina, Baba. These are all the constituencies that are now living the aftermath and the continuous impact of what Bougainville Copper Limited left behind.
Yeah, yeah. And during the crisis, during the PNG Defence Force blockade, I heard a lot of the ways that Bougainvillians coped with that isolation was going back to traditional ways and living with the land, and then innovating, doing these ingenious things with building on the knowledge with the land. And yeah, they were running vehicles off coconut oil and doing hydropower to light up the villages, and using traditional medicines and coconut oil for medicine, which is all really brilliant. But as arable land, like you say, gets compromised, is that harder to do, to sort of innovate and use traditional knowledge when more and more land is being polluted?
For me, I can say that I am very much confident that we can be able to use traditional measures to be able to rehabilitate the land, but it only needs a bit of push, like a bit of push or a relief from the people, from the company responsible. Because for myself, there's these, it's common sense for me to say that if I am to create rubbish, I cannot allow another person to clean up my rubbish. So under that understanding, like we actually are working very closely with people in the communities who comes up, they're proposing different ideas on how we can be able to use up the tailing and then be able to reclaim the land, and then we be able to reforest it so that those chemicals can be absorbed through the natural process that we will be able to be working on, which I believe, and that we, together with my community, we have continuously talking about it lately. But the part that I would call on the developers to come back is to, if you're not going to be, it's not like we expect everyone to make us happy, but at least in a sense where you support us with a brick making machine, you just small things, and then we can be able to use up. Because for myself, whatever is left now, that tailing is actually needed. It's needed back by Bougainville. We have swampy land areas that we can be able to backfill and then be able to transform them into agricultural land. So these are the different avenues or different areas that we need the tailings to be used for. But it's just that we need to come on a round table with the developer, so we know that, at the end of the day, their company is made up of people like myself. We can be able to talk, we can be able to find, and then be able to understand each other. And the thing that I can demand as a representative of my people and also a human rights activist is, we have to come to a mutual understanding and respect, first of all. Because, we can agree on one thing, but when a company has their own agenda, it will always be a divisive agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us a bit about, I know there are people in certain areas who are gold panning in the toxic water, because at this point, because of toxins spreading to arable land and things, it is their only option. So Bougainville was renowned for really fertile soil in lots of areas, but more and more people aren't able to grow crops with like watermelons and coconut and cacao and all this stuff that they were doing perhaps before. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety in these communities because they know doing the gold panning and stuff that they are getting sick and getting diseases and pregnancy complications. And yeah, can you speak to that, that fear and anxiety and the fact that the community knows that they're getting sick, but they can't do anything about it because their options have been taken away?
Well, very much. I should say that if you happen to just come across a woman and you ask her, why is it that you seem to be panning every day? And this is what she'll tell you. Do I have any other choice? Do I have any other option that I can, go to? I mean, be able to make ends meet for my family? What people are doing and what the development has done to my people is really, we've been placed in a position we don't have choice. We really don't have much choice because as we speak, the chemicals are leaching into the arable land areas, and it's lowering, and the land now becomes, it's not enough it's not fertile enough to produce, and then help families make ends meet from selling other products like through farming, taro, and all the other activities. So that's the shortest, the most easiest they see, although it's the most dangerous and not health friendly, is panning gold. They know, and then this is what they'll tell you every day. We know our life is short, but do we have any other choice? And these are the things that have, given all these, they've come to a point that just giving simply because they have to do it to make sure that they make a bit of money to put food on the table for their children. And this is a vicious cycle that has already been developed. Kids grow up, they're not seeing importance in education because the other privileges that they have been taken away. So we Bougainville, specifically the constituency that I come from, we're put in this position that we really don't have any choice.
Yeah. And also the flooding and the toxin spreading into new areas is losing more cultural and sacred sites, and that there were a lot of it lost obviously with the pit and with the original mine. But reading the report, a lot of elders grieving for areas that were still there that have since been flooded. Could you speak a bit about Bougainville's relationship to land in a cultural sense? Like there was some really beautiful quotes in the report from people talking about land is your physical life and sustenance, but also your social life and security and politics and spirituality. So yeah.
Well, land to just, this is the way I put it, because like having, our spiritual relationship with the land is just like when you look at a human person. When you look at a human person, that person has flesh and that person has blood. So when you look at land is land and water. I will have to go a little bit further. Land and water, they are all like in a human form. You're talking about blood, you're talking about flesh and blood. So that's a relationship that we have. We are inseparable. And that's like, it's like you, if in the sense of mining, when we're talking about mining the land, for myself as a woman who's directly connected to the land, I would say that It's just like you telling me to cut my own skin, remove my flesh, and get my child to eat. So that's how intact land is to the people. And when that happens, and then, you know, our connection, I mean, before Christianity came into Bougainville, we connect to God through the sacred sites. We connect to God through that fish or the snake or whatever other creature that lives in that particular area of the land. And when we go for hunting, we go and talk. When we're going to fishing, we do a bit of sacrifice, like how it's done in the Bible times, like in the Old Testament. I see Moses offering sacrifice. We have that in our culture. We have that in our system of life. So, you know, when through the extractive industrial development that took place in Bougainville, it actually denied Bougainvillians our connection to God through those sacred sites. So having done that is another way of cutting the connection between, you know, like when a child is born and then you have the umbilical cord that connects you to, it's like our connection to God is completely cut off. And this is where, for us, this is where when our connection to the sacred sites, because those sacred sites are not for one, it's not there to do one thing or meet a need in one area only. It's there for initiation. There are certain sacred sites that are there to connect people to the land, to their God, to be able to get food or protein or any other aquatic life. You know, these are different area. I mean, different types of the sacred sites that we have. So given that, when people were detached from that through the development, it's like we have no connection to God through the land. We've lost the land, we've lost everything, we've lost our strength, even our intellect is connected to the land. So that's where, for us as Bougainvillians, we see when there is uncontrolled social disorder in the community, we blame it to that, because if there is that connection, we can be able to put this spiritual sense of control and development for every single child that is born into a family, into a clan, and into a society.
And you mentioned the role of women traditionally in the Melanesian matrilineal society. Like, women were the custodians of the land and the protectors and the owners of the land. So how important now are women's voices in decision making about extractive industries, because they are the traditional custodians of land?
Well, let me say that, I mean, for Bougainville, specifically for the politics that is now happening in Bougainville, we say one thing and we're doing another thing. And that's where the problem lies. You know, we politically telling everyone the women own the land. They're the ones who will come up with the decision. That is, and that is Bougainville politics. But today we talk about Bougainville politics, but we're doing another politics which is foreign to Bougainville. Women are never given that space. Like in my case, although I am a woman who owned the land, I am still challenged. I am criticized. So this is the problem, that we've developed it ourselves, but I believe that if it was never for the presence, because, you know, when the company, especially Rio Tinto, when Rio Tinto came into Bougainville, it entertained the men. And that was where it fed the men with ego. And now they tend to stand on women's toes and say, you go to the back. I am the one who's going to deal with the company. That's the problem we have now. And I cannot 100% blame it to the Bougainvillian men, but I will blame it to the way the company came in and it never handled and respected Bougainville, the Melanesian politics.
Yeah, and I mean, colonialism generally is very patriarchal, and I think that's the sort of thing, you know, I know Australia had a big hand in Rio Tinto coming in. It was an Australian company and the Australian colonial administration, and we, in this country, we're still a colonial country. We don't have a treaty with our First Peoples, and there is definitely different law, and land is not being respected in a similar way here as well because of those systems. So
Sorry, may I just said something else?
Yeah,
well, and the other thing that I see, of course, like apart from the Australian colonial administration coming into Bougainville is, you know, I've been even very vocal right now in the government that I want all the stakeholders that had a part to play to come out clear, because we cannot just blame Australian colonial administration. My church, Catholic Church, had a role to play as well. So, you know, this is something that we need to work on together. At the end of the day, we all need to see this together. Australia, we will also have to free Australia, because if there were other key players as well, you know, because at the end of the day, we cannot allow to break that relationship that we have with Australia, with the church. Because, I mean, you know, the way that I see it with regards to the Bougainville Panguna politics especially, we keep blaming Australia. We keep blaming Australia for everything. But didn't the church play a role? Didn't the church had a role, had a hand to play? So this is all agenda that, you know, it needs us to sit together and then be able to iron out so that the world will see justice, and justice in its fullness. Because, you know, we cannot just say force Australia to accept that I was 100% wrong. There are other stakeholders who had a part to play in that. And they all need to reconcile on all these things. It's not about us putting burden on each other, but it's about making sure that we feel that peace. And when we feel that peace, we need to accept each other as people in the global community. Yeah.
Beautifully said. And you're a mother of two and a teacher as well. So what kind of environment do you dream of for your children if you can get some justice and clean up and remediation and things like that?
You know, I mean, being a mother, being a teacher of so many children, you know, the biggest desire that I'd like to have, and in my lifetime, especially when I'm alive, I'd like to see my children seeing that environment that they've been living in, that we made them come into this world on, is not a real environment. I want them to be able to at least through the rehabilitation process, let's be able to bring real life back to these children so that they can find their attachment to the land. They can be able to find their connection back to the environment, back to the forest. You know, I for myself, being a mother, being a teacher, being an activist, and now being a political representative, I want to make sure that in my lifetime, things have to change, and that we need to allow that Bougainville has to open way for justice to find its way back into our global community. Because for myself, I do not want to die with an incomplete mission that my child will say, my mother wasn't able to do anything for me. Now I keep struggling. I mean, you know, at the first place, my son did not ask to be born. I made up my mind as the mother to bring that child into the world. And having done that, I have the responsibility to ensure that I leave that child at least be able to contribute to creating a pristine environment. Not that we will make it 100% clean, but at least we bring hope to these children. And apart from that as well, being a mother, I want to be a mother or my child later on would look upon me as a model, who will fight for his justice, who will fight for his liberation, not just politically, but environmentally as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So at the end of the Human Rights Law Centre report, it outlines priority needs that the community has identified, like water monitoring and the reinforcement of levees so that they stop breaking down, and assistance to clean drinking water. I know that this is an ask of Rio Tinto and of the governments involved and everything, but is there any way that people listening in Australia now, just ordinary people, can help with those direct community needs? Are there any places we can donate to community organisations or something like that?
For myself, I would say that, you know, like, apart from us thinking big and all that stuff, I would appreciate if we at the civil society level, or as people of various different communities, if you can be able to support, like, at the very least, with by donating a tank to a community, or by fundraising to at least help my community to be able to have a brick making machine, a very small one, so that, you know, these people can be able to do something productive for themselves, and then be able to start rebuilding themselves, rehabilitating themselves in small ways. Because for myself, I do not believe in big things. I'd rather talk about small things that, you know, because through this the way of giving, and especially if our people throughout Australia can be able to donate the little that they have, it can also contribute in you know, giving that thought that, oh, not, Australia is a good country. You know, these are the small things that we can be able to do as brothers and sisters, after all, in this global community. So I would really appreciate, like, you know, in small ways, if donations can come, especially for small machines, portable machines that can help people to make their own bricks, and then they start building their houses, because these are the big recommendations that we have for people to be relocated, for people to be given water supplies and all other big projects. But I believe that if we, through this partnership, through especially listening to what I am saying, if we can start off helping these people who are so unfortunate, my people especially, with the little that we have, and then we train them, that the little support, the donations, and then they be able to do whatever they can also teach themselves to rehabilitate themselves, instead of waiting for the government to do everything for us. Because I believe in rehabilitating myself, and then allowing growth and healing to take place from the very, you know, turn something that looks bad now into something positive, and then it creates that impact in a wider community. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And how do you feel about the fact that the political conversation, both locally and internationally at the moment, seems to be about whether or not to allow mining to start up again, or whether or not to reopen the Panguna mine, rather than about the lived experience of people in your community who are still suffering from the legacy issues that are nowhere near resolved?
For myself, I should say that the agenda of reopening, and then there's political talks on the push for reopening, I can honestly say that, being a woman and being someone who have lived with the community, I've seen people struggle. There is nothing that will bring change. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to talk about redevelopment, we're talking about worsening the issue. We're talking about opening up those scars that were created during the civil unrest. We're talking about creating new issues on top of the legacy issues that we have. We're talking about creating new matters, new issues that we call for reconciliation, whilst we still sit down and we pretend as if there were no other issues that calls for international reconciliation. Because for myself, I can honestly say that issue of Panguna calls for an international reconciliation, that we need to come face to face, talk with each other, look for ways to rehabilitate, and let's reconcile and rule it out. Even if it has never happened in the world, it has to happen. You know, being humans, because this is what I've always been talking about while it's appealing to the undo the titles, and let's look at each other as humans, and let's treat each other as, you know, that we are just one community in this global community. Because if we are to pretend and say that we don't know each other, where are we going to go? This is a small world. So for myself, I am not comfortable with the agenda. I am not comfortable at all with the agenda of redevelopment without addressing the legacy issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did an interview in 2018 with Christina Hill from Jubilee Australia, and it, in a larger report about alternatives to mining. What do you think about some of those alternatives in terms of subsidising traditional practices and enabling independence through like a variety of different practices in farming instead of mining?
Okay, for myself, with regards to the alternatives to the, I mean, especially when it comes to economic generation or revenue creation avenue for Bougainville, this is, I mean, this is the way I put things to make the alternatives look very clear. First of all, I see, you know, Bougainville should go into production, whether it be farming, fishing, all these other things, and then be able to generate the income and be, you know, for the government to facilitate the creation of markets, and then for the government to help with creation of transport so that people can be able to transport their produces locally and domestically throughout the country. And also, and then having said that, like in my community as an alternative, since I am a very big advocate for against the agenda of the redevelopment of Panguna, I've been encouraging communities to build up their village treasuries. Like, you know, they pay tax into the community treasury. So they're building that up. And in my constituency, so far the highest has gone with the production and sales, and then people being able to create their own treasuries in the communities. I think the highest so far that what we are looking at as I speak is 34,000 kina just in this year. So this is how fast, you know, people can be able, and then we can be able to measure our the economic value of Bougainville through what the communities are doing, because their revenue, when they're generating it internally, they are able to build and then employ themselves at the micro level. And the other alternative that I am looking forward and I wish to see, and this is something which our revolutionary leaders have always been talking about, is we just want a safe economic corridor where we can sell our cocoa, where we can sell our downstream cocoa to Australia, to Japan, where there are chocolate factories. Because, I mean, these are the things that does not require a CV, curriculum vitae for you to apply, because you have the land. And for myself, I believe that the alternative to generating revenue for Bougainville lies with tilling of the land and then being productive using your own land, because here in Bougainville we still have the upper hand. We own the land. The government does not own the land. So let's put that land to work. Let's make it work so that it can help our families, relieve them, and then be able to contribute to the economic generation of this new nation in the Pacific.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, guys. I just stopped a bit abruptly at the end because the next part of our conversation was actually about setting up a crowdfunder so that we as a global community can support Theonila's community. She's obviously an incredible advocate and activist. And we will be doing that and sending it around. If people haven't registered through MailChimp or don't think that they're in touch with Blockade Armor, please put your email in the chat so we can make sure we can send that around to you. Also, I forgot to say at the start, there's a lot of talk about nation building, and in there, they have actually just elected a new president for the autonomous Bougainville government, who's Ismail Torama, and he was actually one of the revolutionary leaders, a commander for the Bougainvillean Revolutionary Army. They've got a bit of a long history of having people who were involved in that resistance as leaders in Parliament. But yeah, obviously it's really important to remember the stuff about women's ownership of land and all the incredible stuff that Theonila just talked about. We've also got, yeah, I think Nat's just made a good point in the chat, supporting with training and building and skills. Absolutely. So yeah, we might do a bit of a call out for those sorts of things in the follow-up email as well. We've got another recording with Karen from the Human Rights Law Centre as well. I just quickly want to see if I can, Will, in the links there should be a link to the Human Rights and Law Centre report. If you could share that in the chat with everyone, that would be really incredible. Highly recommend reading the full report, everyone, for proper context about what's going on. And I'll just find the next video. I'll just share my screen again. That's still the original one. Hang on a sec. Human Rights Law Centre to look into what was going on in Bougainville and produce this amazing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we got contacted a little over a year ago, about 18 months ago, by some academics in Queensland who had been working with the Bougainville Catholic Diocese, who, after Rio Tinto divested from the Panguna mine back in 2016, had been working on a project with local communities to try and document the impacts of the mine and in order to raise concerns with Rio Tinto. And we decided after we spoke to them that we really needed to go out there and look at these issues for ourselves. And to be honest, you know, when I got out there, sort of first went out there in September 2019, things were a lot more serious than I had even expected, even on the basis of what, you know, knowing that this was a kind of a major environmental disaster in our region and had been going on for a long time. But also the extent to which the issues were kind of an ongoing risk for communities rather than simply legacy issues that they've been living with for 30 years was one of the kind of key things that we immediately noticed when we started looking at this, you know, that the mine waste was continuing to move into new areas, affecting communities that had never been impacted previously, that, you know, further up closer to the mine, that there were issues with levees built at the time of the mine being undermined, and the river potentially having the possibility of bursting through those levees and flooding nearby villages. These are the kinds of risks that people are living with. And because the mine, you know, the mine infrastructure has been deteriorating now over a long period of time, because, you know, since the mine was abandoned by Rio Tinto in the context of the uprising in 1989, there's a lot of these sort of, you know, unredressed issues that are increasingly dangerous for communities out there.
Yeah, the ongoing nature of things is what really struck me about the report as well. I'd done a little bit of research in sort of the situation in Bougainville since the Civil War, but I had no idea that places were continuing to flood, that land was continuing to be lost until reading your report. So it's really, really important, revealing work there for sure. In the report, you said the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights recognise that a delayed response may affect remediability. So yeah, that's certainly the case with the Panguna mine because it's been so delayed. Is it possible to rehabilitate this landscape after such neglect over time and the cumulative impacts?
Well, I think that, I mean, one of the reasons why communities there are calling in the first instance for an urgent kind of assessment, environmental and human rights assessment by qualified experts is to identify which are the key issues that pose a most severe kind of health and safety risks. So, you know, we know, for example, that the rivers are heavily contaminated with copper and other heavy metals, but the extent of that contamination and the sort of risks that it poses for communities are unknown because that's never been kind of looked into. And likewise, in relation to how the billion tonnes of mine waste tailings that have been left in the Jabba-Kawarong River Valley, how those are dealt with and whether it's possible to kind of clean them up fully or to address some of the the very widespread environmental damage. These are all questions that need to be looked at urgently by experts and recommendations developed as to how they should be dealt with. I think what we can say is that there's certainly some issues that could be immediately dealt with that would help to reduce the really severe impacts on communities, such as things like the development of infrastructure to get safe water, which is a major concern for many of the communities living all downstream of the mine. But you know, whether the damage can be fully cleaned up, I think is a little bit unknown at this point. Certainly, we think it's Rio Tinto's obligation to do everything that it can to ensure that the landscape is properly remediated.
Yeah, for sure. And your report that was released in April, you took that to the Australian government, and they've actually recently this month agreed to mediate talks between Rio Tinto and the Bougainville traditional landowners that are represented in the report. How do you think these negotiations will go?
Well, I mean, the first thing is to say is that, you know, we brought the complaint to the Australian government on behalf of 156 members of 4 different villages downstream of the mine. And they wanted us to do that partly because they've been attempting to raise these issues with Rio Tinto for a long time and have got nowhere. And there is this complaint function within the Australian Department of Treasury, which is supposed to oversees responsible business conduct by Australian companies overseas. That mechanism is largely a dispute resolution mechanism. It's not like a court, or, you know, they can't make kind of binding findings on companies, but in light of you know, the exposure that Rio Tinto has received in Australia and elsewhere in relation to its recent impacts at Juukan Gorge, I think they will be taking that process very seriously. And the most sort of, I guess, positive indication that we've had to date is that as soon as that complaint was brought, Rio Tinto agreed that it would sit down with communities to discuss these issues again. Now, that's a major shift in the company's position of the last 30 years, which has always been that they bore no responsibility for any ongoing environmental and human rights impacts because they had been forcibly ejected from the island, and that they believed that they were in full compliance with the standards of the day. You know, I think it's unlikely that they would have opened the door to those discussions if they had no intention of doing anything. You know, I think we welcome, you know, the opportunity to discuss things with them, but we will, you know, have to be very clear that those discussions can't be just talk and that they need to be followed with meaningful action.
Yeah, well, they were certainly aware of it in 2013 and 14 when they were actually in discussions with the autonomous Bougainville government and the Papua New Guinea government about potentially reopening the mine, and the clear response from local landowners at that time seemed to be not until these legacy issues have been addressed. And then, of course, they abruptly divested from the mine and gave the shareholding to the governments in question. So, I mean, considering that sort of behaviour in the past, yeah, do you think the context has changed enough now that they're going to have to be accountable? They've just seemed, in that instance, and also after the report in 1989 that showed that they were pretty much conscious of their negligence during and after the mine's operation. But you're confident that now there's so much more accountability that maybe things have changed?
I do think that we're dealing with a very different context at the moment, where, you know, Rio Tinto is under significant scrutiny from its shareholders, from members of the public, from you know, members of Parliament in Australia, in relation to the way it deals with communities on the ground and the impacts of its operations because of their actions at Juukan Gorge. So I do think, you know, they've said, you know, following that that disaster and the Senate inquiry into that, they've said that they are very committed to learning lessons from what happened at Juukan Gorge, and to looking at the discrepancy or any discrepancies between what they say they do and, you know, and how communities experience that on the ground. So I think we just have to take them at their word for the time being, and to say, well, you know, this is your chance to demonstrate it. And I'm hopeful that with new leadership also coming into the company in the early new year, with the departure of J.S. Jack and some other senior executives, you know, that we're hopeful that the new leadership will see the real importance of, if they want to re-establish Rio Tinto's reputation globally, of dealing with these kind of legacy issues.
Yeah, and you've previously stated to The Guardian that the Human Rights Law Centre wouldn't rule out further legal action if an agreement couldn't be reached. What could this look like potentially?
Well, I think it's important that we focus at the moment on what can be achieved through this process, rather than speculating on you know, what form legal action could take. But certainly there are very serious breaches of people's rights that are occurring, both their rights under the Papua New Guinea Constitution and potentially also under Australian or UK law, as the company is headquartered dually in Australia and the UK. And we'll have to look at those issues more closely if these discussions don't lead to the sort of action that communities are calling for. But it's important to note, I think, that that legal action of this kind, really the main outcome of a legal case is usually compensation, even if it's successful. It can't force a kind of a clean up and proper kind of redress for communities of the kind that communities are really calling for and need in Bougainville. And so I'm really hopeful that through these kind of discussions, that a fruitful outcome can be realised that actually deals with the reality of what people are facing on the ground and addressing those urgent risks. Because money to individuals is not going to solve these huge problems. Communities need, that might need to be part of the discussion, but communities need a lot more than that.
Yeah, at the end of your report, you've detailed priority needs identified by the community, such as water and reinforcements of levees and reconstruction of bridges, water monitoring and, actual food aid and all these practical things. I suppose, you've detailed in the report that some of the responsibility is Rio's and PNG government, autonomous Bougainville government, but you've also noted that without Rio Tinto's backing or Australia's backing, the autonomous Bougainville government and the PNG government alone just don't have the resources to clean up the site because it would cost billions. So is that sort of the key importance of this accountability process you're pursuing? Because without something like this, they can't do it without Rio Tinto taking accountability in terms of practically achieving justice for people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that, you know, as you know, the autonomous Bougainville government has very limited resources, and they're also attempting to now move in the direction of establishing themselves as the world's newest nation, and those kind of discussions with PNG, which will mean that they have even more revenue that they need to find just to kind of run the basic services and provide that kind of level of government for their people. So, you know, Rio Tinto is one of the world's richest companies. The sort of money that would be needed to do the kind of environmental and human rights impact assessment that people are calling for would really be small change for a company like Rio Tinto. I think the more significant question is how much it will cost to actually undertake the sort of remediation work that's necessary to really properly ensure that the site is safe and that the environment is restored as much as is possible. And we won't really know that until a proper assessment is done as to how much that would cost. But I would expect that would be a very significant amount. And I think you know, there's no chance that the Bougainville government or even the PNG government would be able to kind of fund that sort of work on their own. So Rio Tinto's involvement really is needed. It's also worth noting that, you know, Bougainville Copper Limited, that you know, was formerly Rio Tinto's subsidiary that ran the mine, is now also essentially a shell company which has almost no resources. So you know, I think one of the reasons that they have welcomed the potential for renewed discussions is because they also have very limited resources to be able to do anything about this without Rio Tinto's backing.
And the Australian Bougainville government now owns a 36.4% share in BCL. And there's been talk about reopening Panguna as a way of economic self-sufficiency if Bougainville becomes independent. How do you feel about this, given how people are living, because these legacy issues haven't even been addressed yet, like the future of mining in Bougainville?
Well, I'm sure that Theonila will comment a lot more on that, but, you know, I guess our position as the Human Rights Law Centre is it's not for us to decide whether the mine should be reopened or not. That's very much a question that is for the Bougainville people. But where we note that there was huge unity among people was that everyone in Bougainville, irrespective of whether they feel the mine should be reopened or not, feels that Rio Tinto should be accountable for the massive legacy of environmental and social destruction that they've left behind. So, you know, that is why we're working with communities, a very carefully crafted calls that have a unifying message, and that had really wide cross-section of buy-in from communities in terms of Rio Tinto's responsibility. What happens from there, you know, is something that Theonila and others who are, you know, representatives for their people will need to work on. But obviously, you know, one key thing, irrespective of what happens, is if there are Australian companies that are involved in further, you know, mining exploration in Bougainville, that the Bougainville government needs to really make sure that that much better frameworks are put in place to ensure that this kind of damage can't happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are Australian Stock Exchange companies circling and having these discussions about mining in Bougainville at the moment. At least 4 are registered in Perth alone. We've got RTG, Kalia Limited, Toogie Forests companies sniffing around. So what do you think ordinary Australians can do about Australian-linked companies overseas? Like, is there any way that we can hold them to account ahead of time?
I think there's quite a few different things that can be done. I mean, broadly, we believe that there should be a much better regulatory framework put in place for oversight of companies' activities overseas, and companies should be required to undertake human rights due diligence before they you know, get involved in major projects overseas, in the same way that they have to submit an environmental impact assessment here in Australia for their activities. But, you know, also I think that there's a lot that can be done in relation to even under the current framework, ensuring that companies are held to account better. You know, one of the key things that we've seen over the past couple of years is a real rise in Australia of shareholder activism, for example, with people taking action through their super funds and through shareholder resolutions at company meetings to ensure that companies can be held to account. So that's one way, for example, for people to get involved in a more significant way here in Australia. And the other sorts of things are to be supporting law reform efforts and really sending strong messages to the Australian government that it matters what we do overseas. I think in Australia sometimes, we have, despite our kind of growing global footprint in terms of Australian mining companies in particular operating overseas, there's very little responsibility taken. It can be a bit sort of out of sight, out of mind, especially when they're operating in far-flung places out of public view. So I think that we need a lot better kind of reporting back on what companies are doing. I think we need to improve that kind of transparency, but ultimately at the end of the day, we need to ensure that there's proper regulation that provides pathways to justice for people when things go wrong and for communities to be able to raise complaints like this. So another thing that we've called for is for a strengthening of this process through the Australian government, this Australian OECD national contact point, so that it has some real teeth to be able to actually investigate companies that are accused of serious human rights and environmental destruction overseas, and actually ensure that they are held to account here.
Yeah, well, I mean, Rio Tinto when they divested from Panguna, it was around the same time as it dumped other controversial projects in places like Alaska and Indonesia, and there were already regulatory frameworks like the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, like the OECD guidelines that are relevant with this case. Given the track record of companies like Rio Tinto, of mining companies, massive mining companies around the world, not just in Bougainville and in Australia too, we're talking about Australia's regulatory system. How useful are these standards and obligations really?
Well, I think that they're an important first step, but the point that we would make about all of those is that they're ultimately, at the end of the day, they're guidelines, they're not guiding laws. And what we need are real kind of laws with teeth to ensure that companies are held to account when things go wrong or where they take action that really harms people and the planet. I think it's the UN guiding principles have been really important in starting a long kind of a global discussion about the responsibility that companies have for human rights abuses as well, and not just governments, because traditionally it's just been the role of governments. But at the end of the day, Australia needs to implement its obligations under the UN guiding principles by enacting a policy framework and laws here that actually give effect to the principles in that treaty. So the principle that companies have an obligation to provide redress when their operations cause or contribute to serious human rights abuses, for example, that needs to be given effect in law to make it a meaningful reality for people.
Yeah, for sure. And Australia's role, again, they were the colonial power that originally approved the mine and established the weak environmental framework that was associated with its initial approval. Yeah, I don't think most Australians are aware of that or even know what's going on, which is deeply disturbing. Australian government is deeply implicated in this. So yeah, what is their true responsibility, do you think, and what can we do about it specifically to hold the government to account?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Australia bears very significant responsibility in this specific case because, without Australia, the exploration for this mine would never have proceeded in the first place. Australia also was, the party that excluded the local Bougainvillians and landowners from the process of agreeing the framework for the mine, so that ultimately the framework that was agreed was something between the Australian government and the company, which is part of the reason along with the environmental damage, why there was so much kind of controversy and so much local anger about the mine, because people were left to live with the costs but not having received the benefits of what that agreement was. I think that Australia has, what communities have called for is for an independent fund to be established by Rio Tinto and others, including the Australian government and the PNG government, to help address the problems that they're now facing. And we would say that Australia does have a very significant responsibility to help address these problems. But again, I think that the first step is to bring Rio Tinto to the table as the primary, company and primary entity that caused the environmental problems, and then to see also whether the Australian government and PNG government would contribute to such a fund. But in any event, Australia has a very strong role in relation to Bougainville and Bougainville's independence as a nation. And I think that there's a whole range of things that can be done in terms of both through the overseas aid program and also diplomatically, to try and ensure that these problems are addressed. And we'll certainly be attempting to contact the Australian government and have discussions with them about that.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few more questions, last couple. Thank you very, very much for your time. Appreciate it. First of all, I know this is being pursued through the report and everything like that, and I'm sure there are community organisations that people listening to contribute can contribute to, which I will be asking Theonila. But how can listeners today support you at the Human Rights Law Centre in this case, and how might they be able to support Bougainvillians more directly?
Yeah, I think, Theonila will be able to comment on much more on how people can support Bougainvillians more directly. In terms of this particular complaint, I think, we're going to be engaging in discussions with Rio Tinto over the next period, over the next few months. If those discussions, don't lead anywhere, or it appears that Rio Tinto is not undertaking those discussions in good faith, I'm sure that we will be, stepping up the public campaign in relation to this issue on behalf of communities. And at that point, I think it will be, really critical that as many people stand up as possible and make a noise about this, particularly, at Rio Tinto's AGM next year, and at other points potentially. But at the moment, we're kind of involved in this process, and we intend to go into those discussions in good faith and see what can be achieved through them.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Karen. I really appreciate it. Okay, so yeah, that was Karen. We've heard from both our amazing speakers today. Thanks again, everyone, for being on this event. I just want to flag that obviously all of this is in context with systemic and structural problems that we've discussed throughout the conference elsewhere, like global capitalism, pressure for new nations to participate in global capitalism is one big reason why, even members of the autonomous Bougainville government are calling for mining to restart in Bougainville, because they see it as the only way to participate in the international community economically. And another point is obviously colonialism, which we did chat to Theonila about. There's a report in the run sheet, well, if you want to find the Jubilee link, that goes into colonialism in Bougainville a little bit. And then if you wouldn't mind also sharing, we have a forum on Friday night as part of this Blockade IMARC conference on colonialism and sovereignty in so-called Australia. The sovereign peoples of this continent that we're all on are obviously the various Aboriginal nations around the country. So we keep talking about the Australian government and its responsibilities, but we know it's illegitimate. And to dig more into that sort of stuff, please come on Friday night. Yeah, so thank you very much. We had a couple of questions in the chat about specifically mining companies' responsibilities and how they actually can do these kinds of reparations. I think a really good place to look for that is the report itself. So that Human Rights Law Centre report, they've actually got recommendations for Rio Tinto and for all the governments involved. It's a really incredible resource. And then we'll just quickly share in the chat as well a short video that you can watch after this session from Jubilee Australia, who did the report, another report there about alternatives in Bougainville economically. And then there's the link to the Coconut Revolution film. We are screening it tonight, so join us as a community to watch it. That would be preferable, obviously, to all watch it together. It's got a lot of background on the Civil War and the initial uprising. It's a really, really good film to watch to get across sort of the history of resistance in Bougainville. But the link is there. The full film is on the internet if you want to watch it at another time. You can't watch it today. And as I said before, we're going to be in touch about ways that you can assist, whether it's volunteering on the ground, whether it's a crowdfunder, which we will send around as soon as possible, because as Theonila said, we are all part of a global community together, and it's our responsibility to support one another. So thank you very, very much, everyone, for being on this session. Please take time to jump into the chat and open those links. And yeah, as Will just said, streaming together at 9 p.m. tonight, we have the Coconut Revolution film, which is all about this issue. Thank you so much, everybody. I'll give you a few minutes to say goodbye and jump in the chat, and then we'll end the meeting.
And just a reminder, for all the links in the chat, you can download the chat as a file if you want to save them for later. Thanks, everyone.